Daniel, when he later confronted Belshazzar, and he said, King, how is it that you have rejected the message that saved your grandfather? He had courage. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 28:1 that the wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. And as Christians, as we confront evil, we are called to be confident, not arrogant. Paul here in this passage was not arrogant, but he was confident because the message that he was preaching had changed his lives. And as fathers, our children need to see in us this same kind of confidence, not the kind that comes from a false sense of bravado, but rather from a man whose life has been changed by the God that he worships daily. And when we have this kind of confidence, then we are prepared to ride out and meet evil head on. Notice what Paul said later in that verse, to speak to you the gospel of God amid much opposition. So what are we called to be bold in the face of? Paul said that he didn't just encounter opposition, he encountered much opposition. And the opposition that he was referring to here was the struggles with the dangers that stood in the way of faith. And I want to tell you today that the opposition that you and I are faced with is not flesh and blood opposition. It's not people, though oftentimes people and flesh and blood gets caught in the middle. Our opposition is spiritual in nature. And therefore, it requires that we wage spiritual warfare. The battlefield upon which this spiritual warfare is fought manifests itself in ideas and policies. And now is no time for the Church of Jesus Christ to be timid. Now more than ever, we have to boldly face the evil of our time. But instead of being bold like lions, oftentimes we're like ostriches. And we stick our heads in the sand, hoping somehow that the evil will go around us, that it'll take a detour, and it never does. It only grows and gets more complex. A few years ago, my uncle was engaged in raising ostriches. Now, I don't know why in the world he ever decided to get into that, but he decided to raise ostriches in West Georgia. And one time I was visiting him, and he had told me, by the way, ostrich is a huge creature, about 8 feet tall. Do you know that when you think of an ostrich, you normally think of a timid creature, because we see pictures of ostriches sticking their heads in the ground when danger is around. And really and truthfully, an ostrich has no reason to stick its head in the ground. In the wild, an ostrich can run 35 miles per hour. It can outrun most animals in the wild. But did you know this, that an ostrich can kick with a force that could snap the spine of a lion? And when I look at the Church of Jesus Christ, and I look at how that we as the possessors of truth, God's revealed truth, why are we so timid in the way that we present the truth? Why do we keep this great truth that can transform culture and transform lives and put marriages back together? Why are we so timid when we possess the truth? I recently finished a short little book by Erwin Lutzer entitled When a Nation Forgets God, 7 Lessons We Must Learn from Nazi Germany. It's a great book, about 141 pages. You could read it in just a few days. Get it on Amazon for about $13. The summary of this book is basically the parallels that exist in our culture today and that which existed in pre-war Nazi Germany. Now, he doesn't call people whom he disagrees with Nazis. And we've seen far too much of that lately in American politics. Republicans call Democrats Nazis. Democrats call Republicans Nazis. Hopefully, we could all get to the point where our discourse can be more civil than that, for certainly what the Nazis did during World War II places them in a category all by themselves. But there are some parallels, though, that are present. Things like the government trying to silence the church, lawmakers trying to determine and tell us how to behave in every aspect of our life, media attempting to develop the belief system of the culture, and then churches tying gospel and nationalism together. But through it all, Erwin Lutzer points this out, that even in the great cloud of darkness that had descended upon Nazi Germany, there were still bright rays of hope. There were still, the light of truth was still shining. 2 pastors he talks about in particular, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller was the other one. I put their picture up on the screen. Bonhoeffer and Niemöller both went and confronted Hitler to his face in his office and told him they were concerned about the direction of the country. Now, both men stood for righteousness. Both men boldly confronted the evil of their time, and both men suffered terribly. Bonhoeffer lost his life, hung 13 days before the fall of Berlin. Niemöller was sent to Auschwitz, where later he was liberated by Allied forces. But both of these men today are probably the greatest examples of heroes in recent church history. You know why? Because they boldly chose to stand against the evil of their time. You know, I hope that you will take some time with your children to read some of our nation's founding documents, particularly the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address. I remember in school I memorized all of the Gettysburg Address, and what a shame that as I ask students today, they don't memorize that anymore. You ought to read the Declaration. You ought to read the Gettysburg Address. Even take time to read the Constitution from time to time. But as you look at the Declaration of Independence, you'll look at all the signatures that are on there. And, of course, the most prolific and the biggest one is John Hancock. But as you'll scroll down and look, you'll see that there's another signature on there. The only pastor who signed the Declaration of Independence was Pastor John Witherspoon, later to found Princeton University. After the War for Independence was over and George Washington became the first president, he invited Witherspoon to come and speak, I believe it's to the first U.S. Congress on the first day of Thanksgiving and prayer. And during that sermon, he said this, that a republic once equally poised must either preserve its virtue or it will lose its liberty. Let me repeat that. A republic once equally poised must either preserve its virtue or lose its liberty. And fathers, today, on this day that's set aside to honor the role that you serve in as the leader of your family, I want to challenge you to stand with me and let's preserve virtue. Because if we don't preserve biblical virtue within our civilization, within our families, if we don't show by example virtue in our own life, then ultimately we will lose our liberty. Number 2, write this down. To become a man of integrity, we must never deviate from the truth. We must never deviate from the truth. Paul said in verse 3, for our exhortation. Now that's a big word. What does he mean by exhortation? Literally it means persuasive discourse. The exhortation that Paul was referring to here was the teaching that he had shared with these Thessalonian believers that had caused them to turn from their false idols to the true and living God. What Paul had shared with them was truth, and this truth had transformed their life. And may I say that the greatest fortune that we can bequeath our children is a solid foundation of faith in God. It's our responsibility as fathers to provide for the material needs of our families, the social needs, the emotional needs. But the greatest way that we can provide for our children is spiritually. Notice what Paul said in verse 3. Our exhortation does not come from error or impurity or by way of deceit. And here he's telling us what truth isn't. So before we get into truth is, let's talk about what truth is not. Number 1, truth is not error. If you'd write that down. He said that our persuasive discourse, our teaching, does not come from error. And it's important that we as fathers function in our families in the role of teacher. And that is that we teach our kids the truth. And it's important that we learn to separate fact from error. Now, error here literally means wrong opinion or intellectual confusion. And I think the idea here is that we learn to separate what is fact from what is opinion. Because you see, today there are a lot of opinions out there that are being offered as fact. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we have to learn to separate the two. Paul emphasized that what he had shared with the Thessalonian believers was not his opinions, but rather it was truth. And truth is worth suffering for. Truth is worth burning at the stake over. Truth is worth facing the gallows over. Truth is worth being beheaded over. Opinions may or may not rise to that level. So truth is not error. Number 2, truth is not impurity. Truth is not impurity. He said that our persuasive discourse or our teaching doesn't come from error or impurity. And literally what he means here is uncleanness. In a moral sense, the impurity of lustful, luxurious, or wasteful living. See, Paul didn't go to Thessalonica after having been beaten in Philippi and share the truth with them so he could get a big offering or get rich. Nor did he share it so that he could have another notch in his belt so that he could pump himself up a little bit to look bigger by having more followers. Paul shared the truth with them because it had changed his life for the better. And he knew that in their accepting of the truth, it would do the same for them as well. Thirdly, truth is not deceitful. Truth is not error. Truth is not impurity. Nor does it come by way of deceit. Literally, it means a lure or a snare. Anybody done any fishing so far this year? I have. Been 11 times since school let out. Remember I told you in, was it January, that I was going to do that? Now, I've only caught 2 fish, so I don't know what I'm doing, but I've had a wonderful time doing it. But going to Shields and you go up there and you see all those lures. Literally what you're trying to do is you're trying to trick the fish is what you're trying to do. You tie that artificial lure on the end of a line and you cast it out. And if you're me, all you get is scum from the bottom of the pond. That's what I'm successful at catching. But one of these days, though, I hope to be successful in actually convincing a fish that this is a meal worth taking.